The moment I realized my life wasn't what I thought it was didn't come with a dramatic confrontation. There were no guilty tears streaming down Rebecca's face, nor was it some incriminating text lighting up her phone in the dead of night. It was quieter than that, so subtle and ordinary at first that I almost dismissed it entirely. It began one evening while we were sitting around the kitchen table. Dylan and I were deep in a conversation about his college options, and Rebecca was flipping through the stack of mail like she often did. Lately, she'd seemed more distant, but I figured it was just the stress of work or the thought of Dylan heading off to college soon. She tossed a thin envelope onto the table with just a little too much force, and it immediately caught Dylan's eye. "What's that?" he asked, picking it up before I even had a chance to glance at it. "Nothing," Rebecca said, her response coming just a bit too fast. "Just some junk mail." Dylan wasn't convinced. He slid the envelope open, and the second he pulled out its contents, it was like the air in the room shifted, suddenly heavier. It was a glossy flyer for a family reunion. But not my family. Not hers either, or at least, not as far as I knew. The name at the top of the invite made my stomach drop, Turner. That was my cousin's last name. "Why do we have this?" Dylan asked, his brow furrowing. "We're not Turners." Rebecca froze, her face stiff for just a moment too long. Then she let out a laugh that didn't sound quite right, sharp and brittle, almost like it was holding something back. "It must have been a mistake," she said, brushing it off. "Probably meant for a neighbor." But Dylan wasn't buying it, and neither was I. Her reaction wasn't just uneasy, it was full-blown panic. The kind of panic that comes when someone realizes a truth they've been hiding might be about to unravel. I tried to shake it off, but that name, Turner, kept gnawing at me. My cousin Scott Turner lived a couple of states away. We weren't close by any stretch, but we'd cross paths at weddings or funerals. He was the kind of family member you don't think much about until something forces you to. And now, that name was right in front of me, practically demanding my attention. That night, my mind wouldn't let it go. Memories I'd buried or dismissed over the years came rushing back all at once. Rebecca's odd reactions whenever Scott's name came up in conversation. The way she'd clam up at family events if he happened to be around. That one time, years ago, when she forgot to mention he'd been in town for a weekend while Dylan was still a baby. None of it had seemed important at the time, why would it? But now, every little detail felt like a piece of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to finish. The next morning, I decided to call Scott. I kept it casual, asking if he'd sent the flyer or if he knew why it might have ended up in our mailbox. He sounded genuinely puzzled at first, then laughed. "That's funny," he said. "I didn't send it, but maybe Rebecca told you about it when we talked last month. She mentioned you guys were thinking of visiting soon." It felt like the ground had just disappeared beneath me. "Last month?" I repeated, forcing my voice to stay calm. "Yeah," he replied. "She called me about Dylan's college stuff. Said she wanted advice on how to help him figure out what he might want to study." I ended the call as smoothly as I could, trying not to let on that my heart was racing. Rebecca had never mentioned calling Scott. In fact, she hadn't brought him up in years. Why would she reach out to him about Dylan's college plans? And why wouldn't she tell me about it? I decided to hold off on confronting her, for now. If there was more to this, I needed real answers, not just suspicions. Something solid to confirm what my gut was already telling me. I owed that to myself, and to Dylan. If this rabbit hole went deeper than I imagined, I had to be sure before I acted. That's when I decided to order a DNA test for both Dylan and me. I thought I was prepared for whatever it might reveal, but when the results finally came in, I realized how wrong I'd been. Reading those results felt like watching the life I'd built crumble right in front of me. The words on the screen were cold, clinical, and devoid of emotion, yet they burned as if they'd been seared into my mind. The report didn't dance around the truth: Dylan wasn't my biological son. The undeniable proof stared back at me in black and white, a truth so stark it left no room for doubt. I sat frozen in front of my laptop, the low hum of the machine filling the otherwise silent room. My hands trembled so much I nearly knocked the mouse to the floor. And while the answer was right there, plain as day, it only raised more questions. If I wasn't Dylan's father, then who was? My thoughts kept circling back to that flyer with the Turner name on it. To Scott's offhand remark about Rebecca reaching out to him. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle, scattered and incomplete, waiting for one crucial piece to bring the whole picture into focus. For the next 2 days, I didn't breathe a word, to Rebecca or Dylan. I went through the motions like a man on autopilot, every word and every smile a mask to cover the storm raging inside me. Rebecca must have sensed something was off, she kept checking in with a cheerful tone that grated on my nerves. Every time she asked if I was okay, the urge to shout the truth in her face clawed at me. But I held it in. I needed more. Something solid. Something undeniable. I buried myself in old photo albums, text messages, and even years-old emails, desperate for answers. The breakthrough came when I was digging through an old storage box in the attic. Inside, I found a stack of faded Polaroids from a family barbecue nearly 18 years ago, right around the time Dylan would have been conceived. One picture, in particular, stopped me cold. There was Rebecca, laughing with her hand resting casually on Scott's arm. It wasn't obvious, but there was something about the way she looked at him that hit me like a punch to the gut. The familiarity, the ease, it wasn't normal. And Scott? The way he looked back at her was just as telling. That's when the anger started to bubble up, hot and raw. It wasn't just the photo, it was every odd look, every quiet moment, every red flag I'd ignored over the years. A dam inside me cracked, and the flood of emotions was unstoppable. I didn't know how deep this betrayal went, but I was done playing the fool. The following evening, I left work early and headed straight home. Rebecca was in the kitchen, humming softly while chopping vegetables for dinner. She smiled at me when I walked in, a smile that once meant everything to me. Now, it felt fake, like a lie wrapped in sweetness. "We need to talk," I said, my voice sharp enough to make her pause mid-chop. She slowly set the knife down and turned to face me, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "What's going on?" she asked cautiously. I didn't sugarcoat it. "Dylan isn't my son." The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. For a moment, her face didn't move, as though her mind was still scrambling to process what I'd just said. Then, all at once, the color drained from her cheeks. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice barely holding steady. "I did a DNA test," I replied, my tone as firm as steel. "Dylan isn't mine. And I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Her eyes darted around the kitchen, searching for something, anything, that might ground her. Finally, she settled on anger, her voice snapping like a whip. "This is ridiculous," she shot back. "You're seriously accusing me of cheating after all these years? Do you even hear yourself?" "I'm not accusing you of anything," I countered, my voice rising with each word. "The test already told me the truth. What I want is to hear it from you." Her composure cracked then, just for an instant. A flicker of panic flashed across her face before she managed to pull herself together, her expression shifting to something cold and distant. "You're being absurd," she said, turning back to the cutting board as if the conversation was over. "I'm not doing this with you." But I wasn't about to let her shut me down, not this time. "Was it Scott?" I asked, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Is that why you've been so weird about him all these years? Is Dylan his?" The knife slipped from her hand, clattering onto the counter as she spun around, her face a storm of shock and anger. "How dare you," she spat, her voice low and sharp. "Scott is your cousin. That's disgusting." "Disgusting?" I let out a bitter laugh, the kind that sounded foreign even to me. You've been lying to me for 17 years, Rebecca. Who knows what else is disgusting? Her eyes narrowed into slits, and for a split second, I thought she might slap me. But she didn't. Instead, she stood there, trembling with rage she could barely contain. I'm not doing this, she said, her voice steady but laced with venom. If you want to destroy our marriage over some stupid test, that's on you. But don't you dare drag my son into this. Her son. The words hit me like a slap. That slip of the tongue, it was another crack in the dam. But instead of pressing her further, I took a step back. For now. This wasn't over. Not even close. The silence in the house after that confrontation was unbearable. Rebecca retreated to the bedroom, slamming the door with the kind of defiance you'd expect from a teenager after a fight. I stayed in the kitchen, left alone with the suffocating weight of unanswered questions. Her deflections, her fury, her refusal to even engage, they weren't the reactions of someone who had nothing to hide. I knew her well enough to recognize when she was lying. But what haunted me more than her denial was the growing certainty that I already knew the truth. Scott. The signs had always been there, lurking in the background like whispers I'd ignored for years. The DNA test had just brought them into focus, screaming loud and clear. If Dylan was Scott's, this wasn't just a betrayal, it was a humiliation. A cruel insult that had lived under my roof for nearly 2 decades. I wasn't just furious, I was humiliated, and that made the anger burn even hotter. Sleep was impossible that night. By the time dawn broke, I had made a decision: if Rebecca wouldn't come clean, I'd find the answers myself. And if Scott was involved, I wouldn't just confront him, I'd make him pay for it. I started carefully, not wanting to tip my hand too soon. At breakfast, I acted like everything was fine, even joking with Dylan about the college he was leaning toward. Rebecca kept stealing glances at me, probably expecting another explosion. I gave her nothing. Let her sit with the tension. After work, I came up with an excuse to leave early. But I wasn't heading home. Instead, I drove 2 hours to Scott's town, where I knew he ran a small automotive shop. I'd only been there once before, years ago, on a trip Rebecca had suggested. At the time, I hadn't thought anything of it. Now, that memory felt like another breadcrumb I'd missed. I parked a block away and walked toward the shop, keeping my head low. Through the open garage doors, I saw him laughing with one of his mechanics, completely unaware of what was coming. He looked the same, broad shoulders, confident swagger, and that cocky grin that had annoyed me since we were kids. I waited until the mechanic stepped away, leaving Scott leaning against a car with his phone in hand, scrolling mindlessly. "Hey, Scott," I called, keeping my voice steady despite the fire burning inside me. He looked up, startled for a moment before his expression shifted to recognition. A grin spread across his face. "Well, look who it is. What brings you all the way out here?" I stepped closer, closing the gap between us. "Funny you should ask." His smile faltered, confusion flickering across his face. "What's going on?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folded DNA report. I opened it deliberately, letting him see the official header before slapping it onto the hood of the car he was leaning against. The sound echoed in the quiet garage, and I stared at him, waiting for a reaction. "You want to explain this?" I asked, my voice low but sharp enough to cut through the tension. Scott glanced at the paper, his forehead creasing in confusion. "What am I looking at?" "It's a DNA test," I said coldly. "And it says Dylan isn't my son." For a moment, he looked genuinely shocked. His eyes flicked from the paper back to me, then down again, as if hoping he'd misread it. "Wait, are you serious?" "As serious as it gets," I said, stepping closer, my tone like ice. "And the more I think about it, the more your name keeps coming up. So I'll ask you one more time, do you want to explain this? He raised his hands in a defensive gesture, his face shifting from surprise to something more guarded. Look, I don't know what you're accusing me of, but I swear, I've got nothing to do with this. Did you sleep with Rebecca? I demanded, my voice rising with each word. For a split second, he hesitated, and that pause told me everything I needed to know. Look, man, that was years ago, he said, his words spilling out in a rush. It didn't mean anything. He didn't get the chance to finish. My fist connected with his jaw before I even realized I'd moved. The force sent him stumbling backward, crashing into the car behind him. I grabbed his collar and yanked him upright, the fury coursing through me unstoppable. How long? I snarled, my face inches from his. How long were you screwing my wife behind my back? Stop, he choked out, his hands raised in surrender. It was one time, okay? Just once. And it was stupid, I didn't even think. I swear, I didn't know Dylan was mine. His words hit me harder than my fist had hit him. I let go of his collar, stepping back as the weight of what he'd just admitted sank in. Dylan wasn't mine. The boy I'd raised, loved, and poured every ounce of my being into was Scott's. The room spun, and I gripped the edge of the car to steady myself. Scott was saying something, an apology, maybe, or more excuses, but his words barely registered. My mind was locked on the cold, brutal truth. This wasn't over. Not even close. I walked out of Scott's shop, my knuckles throbbing and my thoughts in chaos. His confession played in my head on an endless loop, each word scraping against my sanity. One time. He didn't know Dylan was his. Liar. I didn't believe him for a second. Scott had always been the type to dodge responsibility unless there was no other option. Even then, he'd only admit to the bare minimum. But his reaction had been enough to confirm what I needed to know. The truth wasn't a question anymore, it was a cold, ugly fact. As I drove home, the weight of it all settled onto my chest. Dylan wasn't just Scott's son, he was the result of an affair between my wife and my cousin, two people I had trusted more than anyone else in my life. For 17 years, they had lied to me, letting me live a life built on betrayal. The anger I'd felt in Scott's shop hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown sharper, colder, and more calculated. Scott might have thought his half-hearted confession would be the end of it, but he had no idea what was coming. This was far from over. When I got home, the house was eerily quiet. Dylan was out with a friend, and Rebecca was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone as if everything was perfectly normal. She didn't even look up when I walked in. I went to see Scott, I said, my tone calm but carrying an edge that made her freeze. Her fingers hovered over her phone for a moment before she set it down and turned to face me slowly. What? She asked, her voice barely audible. You heard me, I said, stepping closer, my words deliberate and heavy. I went to his shop and asked him about Dylan. Want to know what he told me? Her face went pale. The composure she always prided herself on began to crack, piece by piece. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Cut the act, Rebecca, I snapped, my patience gone. He told me everything. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Slowly, she stood, wrapping her arms around herself like it could shield her from the inevitable. But there was no running from this, not anymore. It was a mistake, she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. It happened once, and it didn't mean anything. Anything? I shot back, cutting her off before she could continue. Don't you dare try to downplay this. You slept with my cousin. You lied to me for 17 years. You let me believe Dylan was mine. Do you even comprehend the damage you've done? Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel even a shred of sympathy. Not anymore. I didn't know, she stammered, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. I didn't know Dylan wasn't yours. I swear, I thought. You thought you could get away with it, I finished for her, my words as sharp as the betrayal I felt. And you almost did. That broke her. She crumpled, sobbing into her hands, but I didn't move to console her. I couldn't. All I could think about was how I'd poured nearly 2 decades of my life into someone who had never been honest with me. I'm sorry, she choked out between sobs. I'm so sorry. But sorry didn't matter, not anymore. Not after everything. In the days that followed, I started laying the groundwork for my plan. Revenge wasn't just an option, it was a necessity. But it had to be calculated, deliberate. I didn't want to lash out recklessly and ruin my chance to make them feel the weight of what they had done. No, it had to be devastating. Their perfect little lives, built on the back of my trust, were about to come crashing down. Rebecca, for her part, seemed to think the worst was behind us. After our confrontation, she started acting like everything could just return to normal, cooking dinner, making small talk, even suggesting we plan a family trip before Dylan left for college. I played along, pretending to consider her ideas, but every smile I gave her was a weapon I intended to wield later. Behind the scenes, I was gathering everything I could, financial records, old messages, social media posts from years ago, anything that might give me an edge. And then there was Dylan. He deserved to know the truth, but not yet. Not until I was ready to show him exactly who his real father was and just how deeply this betrayal ran. My first target was Scott. If he thought admitting to the affair had absolved him, he was in for a rude awakening. Our confrontation at the shop had been the opening act. The real show was just beginning. I wasn't satisfied with exposing him, I wanted to dismantle him. Scott's auto shop was his pride and joy, a small-town business that survived on the trust and loyalty of the community. It thrived because of word of mouth, glowing reviews, and a reputation for reliability. So, that's where I started, stripping him of that trust. I created an anonymous account and began flooding every local review site I could find with scathing complaints. Each review was carefully crafted to sound authentic, claims of overcharging, shoddy work, and even accusations of deliberate damage to cars. They were just believable enough to raise eyebrows but vague enough to avoid being flagged as fake. Within a week, his shop's rating plummeted to a shaky 3 stars. But that was just the beginning. I knew Scott had a knack for cutting corners, not just in his personal life but in his business too. It didn't take much digging to unearth a few skeletons he'd tried to keep buried, infractions he'd quietly brushed aside, like improper waste disposal, unlicensed employees, and skimping on safety inspections. I compiled all of it into a tidy little dossier and sent an anonymous tip to the state licensing board, complete with evidence. The investigation hit his shop like a sledgehammer. Inspectors arrived unannounced, poring over everything, his books, his inventory, even his waste logs. Word spread quickly in a small town, and before long, customers were canceling appointments and employees started jumping ship. Through a mutual acquaintance, I heard that Scott was livid, stomping around the shop and snapping at anyone who so much as looked at him wrong. But that wasn't enough for me. This was just the start. Good. This was just the beginning. At home, Rebecca was doing her best to pretend that life was business as usual, but the tension between us was thick enough to cut with a knife. She had no idea about my plans or the depths of my anger. I kept up the act, smiling when it suited me, making polite conversation when necessary. Inside, though, I was a tightly wound spring, ready to snap. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, she made an attempt to bridge the widening gap between us. "I've been thinking," she said hesitantly, her voice careful. "Maybe we should try counseling. You know, to work through all of this." I set my fork down deliberately, meeting her gaze with a cold, unflinching stare. "Counseling won't fix this, Rebecca." She flinched, like my words had physically struck her, but she didn't push back. Instead, she shifted to another approach. "It was a mistake," she murmured, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "I know I hurt you, but don't you think Dylan deserves to have both his parents together for his last year at home?" Her words were like pouring gasoline onto a fire. Parents? She wanted to talk about parenting after everything she'd done. The audacity of it made my blood boil. I forced myself to stay composed. "I think Dylan deserves the truth," I said, my voice as sharp and cold as a blade. Her eyes widened, panic flooding her expression. "You can't tell him," she said quickly, her tone pleading. "Why not?" I asked, leaning back in my chair with calculated calm. "Don't you think he has a right to know where he really comes from?" She shook her head vehemently, tears spilling over her lashes. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It'll destroy him." I stood abruptly, the sound of the chair scraping against the floor echoing through the room. "The way you destroyed me?" I asked, my tone icy. "This isn't about Dylan. This is about you not wanting to face the consequences of what you've done. But don't worry, Rebecca, the truth has a way of coming out, whether you like it or not." I left the table, her muffled sobs following me down the hallway like a haunting echo. The next stage of my plan wasn't just about words. It was time for Rebecca to feel the weight of her choices, not through another argument, but through actions. That weekend, I found the right moment to start with Dylan. We were in the garage, working on his old bike, when I decided to plant the first seed. "You've been pretty quiet lately," I said, keeping my tone casual as I tightened a bolt. He shrugged, his focus on the chain he was oiling. "Just thinking about college stuff, I guess." "Yeah, and maybe some other things too," I said, watching him closely. He avoided my gaze, and I could tell there was more on his mind. It was time to push a little further. "Dylan," I began, setting down the wrench in my hand, "I need to ask you something important." He looked up, frowning slightly. "What's up?" I took a steadying breath, bracing myself. "If you found out something big about our family, something that would change everything, would you want to know?" His brow furrowed, worry creeping into his expression. "What kind of thing?" "The kind of truth that doesn't leave anything the same," I said carefully. He paused, his hand frozen mid-motion on the bike. After a moment, he nodded. "Yeah. I'd want to know." That was all I needed to hear. The seed was planted. Rebecca had underestimated me, thinking she could control the narrative. But the truth was inevitable, and when it finally surfaced, it wouldn't just be an explanation, it would be a reckoning. The night I decided to finally reveal the truth, the house was unnervingly quiet, as though even the walls were bracing for what was about to happen. I had waited long enough. Rebecca's betrayal had festered in the silence, and Scott's pathetic apologies had done nothing to temper the storm inside me. It was time to end this charade once and for all. Dylan deserved the truth. So did I. That evening, I called both of them into the living room. Rebecca entered cautiously, clutching a mug of tea as if it could shield her from what was coming. Dylan, oblivious to the tension simmering between us, flopped onto the couch, his phone already in hand as he started scrolling. "What's up, Dad?" he asked casually, not even looking up. I drew in a deep breath, my palms damp with sweat. "There's something we need to talk about," I began, my voice steady but heavy with the weight of what was about to unfold. "Something I've been holding on to, but it's time you knew." Dylan put his phone down, his casual demeanor fading as he caught the seriousness in my tone. Rebecca, on the other hand, sat frozen, her face a mask of dread. "This is about the DNA test," I continued, locking eyes with Dylan. He blinked, confusion flickering across his face. "The DNA test? What about it?" I glanced at Rebecca. Her skin was pale, her hands trembling as they gripped the mug tighter. She looked like she might shatter. "It revealed something I didn't expect," I said carefully. "Something I need to tell you." "Don't do this," Rebecca interrupted, her voice shaky and thin. "Not like this." I didn't look at her. "Dylan, the test showed. I'm not your biological father." For a moment, my words seemed to hang in the air, incomprehensible. Dylan stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to process what I'd just said. "What?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm not your biological father," I repeated, my throat tightening as the words left me. "Your mom, she had an affair." "Stop it!" Rebecca yelled suddenly, leaping to her feet. "That's enough." "No." I shot back, my voice firm and unrelenting. "You don't get to silence me anymore. He deserves to know the truth, Rebecca, and you're not going to stop me." Dylan's eyes darted between us, wide with panic and confusion. "Mom," he asked, his voice trembling, "what's he talking about?" Rebecca hesitated, tears spilling down her cheeks. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I stepped forward, keeping my tone steady but resolute. "Dylan," I said, meeting his eyes directly, "the man who fathered you is Scott." The silence that followed was suffocating, thick and oppressive. Dylan looked at me, then at Rebecca, as if searching for some shred of denial or reassurance that this wasn't true. "Scott?" he asked finally, his voice breaking. "Uncle Scott." Rebecca collapsed into the chair, sobbing uncontrollably. Dylan turned to her, disbelief morphing into pure anger. "Tell me he's lying," he demanded, his voice cracking with rage. "Tell me this isn't true." Rebecca couldn't answer. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking under the weight of her sobs. Dylan shot to his feet, his fury erupting. "How could you?" he shouted at her. "How could you do this to Dad? To me?" "Dylan, please," Rebecca cried, reaching out to him. He recoiled as if her touch was poison, his face twisting in disgust. "Don't," he said sharply. "Don't touch me. I can't even look at you right now." He turned to me, his anger softening into desperation. "Dad, what do we do now?" The question hit me like a blow. Dylan had always been my son in every way that mattered. No DNA test could change the bond we'd built. But standing there in the wreckage of everything I thought I knew, I realized I didn't have an easy answer. "We take it one step at a time," I said finally, my voice as firm as I could manage. "But I promise you this, I'm not going anywhere. You're my son, Dylan. That's not going to change." His lip quivered, and for a moment, I thought he might break down. But instead, he nodded, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the truth. Rebecca didn't say another word to me that night. Dylan stormed off to his room, slamming the door behind him. And I was left alone in the living room, surrounded by the shattered pieces of what used to be my family. But I wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The next morning, the house was steeped in a suffocating silence. Dylan stayed holed up in his room, and Rebecca moved around the kitchen like a ghost, her swollen, red eyes a testament to her sleepless night. I didn't feel a shred of pity for her. Words were meaningless at this point, not when there were bigger moves to make. I spent the day making calls. The first was to a private investigator I'd found online who came with glowing reviews for his thoroughness and discretion. I needed him to dig into every corner of Scott's life and unearth every secret he thought he'd buried. If Scott was going to fall, it was going to be catastrophic. The second call was more personal. I reached out to Matt, an old friend who happened to be a sharp, ruthless lawyer. We hadn't spoken in years, but I knew he still owed me a favor. "Man, it's been ages," Matt said when he picked up. His tone was friendly, but I didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Yeah, it has," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "But I need your help." I gave him the basics, leaving out the messiest parts but making it clear that I wanted to dismantle both Scott and Rebecca without exposing myself to any fallout. Matt let out a low whistle when I finished. "Damn, that's brutal," he said. But you've got plenty of options. For the next hour, he walked me through strategies, legal maneuvers, financial tactics, and ways to hit Scott where it would hurt the most. By the end of the call, I had a solid blueprint for destruction. Back at home, the tension between Rebecca and me had reached its peak. That afternoon, she appeared in the doorway of my office, her voice tinged with desperation. "I know you're furious," she began, gripping the frame like it was the only thing holding her upright. "But we need to figure this out. For Dylan." I didn't look up from my laptop. "There's nothing to figure out, Rebecca." "Don't say that," she snapped, her tone shifting to frustration. "We've been married for almost 20 years. You're just going to throw all of that away?" Finally, I leaned back in my chair and met her gaze, my expression cold and unyielding. "You threw it away the moment you decided to sleep with Scott," I said. "And then you buried it for 17 years while I raised his son. Do you even understand what you've done?" Her face crumpled, but I didn't stop. "You didn't just betray me," I continued, my voice growing sharper. "You betrayed Dylan. You robbed him of the truth about who he is. All for what? Because you couldn't resist my cousin?" She opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off with a raised hand. "Don't. I'm done listening to your excuses. From now on, we don't talk about this anymore." For a moment, she stood frozen, her lip trembling as if she might say something else. Then she turned and walked away, the sound of her retreating footsteps echoing down the hall. That night, the private investigator called with his first update. "You were right," he said. "Your cousin's got skeletons, and they're not as hidden as he thinks." He walked me through what he'd found so far: unpaid debts, a messy trail of failed relationships, allegations of harassment, and a questionable business deal that bordered on fraud. "Anything outright illegal?" I asked, my heart hammering. "Not yet," he replied. "But I'm still digging. If there's something, I'll find it." It was a start. The next step in my plan came together quickly. Scott was hosting a family barbecue that weekend, an event he'd planned months in advance. Normally, I'd steer clear of gatherings like that, but this time, I had a reason to attend. Dylan, however, wanted no part of it. "I can't face him," he said, his voice tight with anger. "You need to," I told him, my tone firm but calm. "You deserve answers." Reluctantly, he agreed. By the time we arrived, the barbecue was in full swing. Scott greeted us with his usual cocky grin, but the moment our eyes met, I saw it, the flicker of unease. "Didn't think you'd show up," he said, clapping me on the shoulder like we were old friends. I forced a smile, the kind that didn't reach my eyes. "Wouldn't miss it." For a while, we danced around each other, making small talk and pretending nothing was wrong. But I was just waiting for the right moment. Finally, I saw my opening. I stepped into the center of the yard and raised my glass high. "Hey, everyone," I called out, raising my voice just enough to command attention. "I'd like to say a few words." The hum of conversation died down, and all eyes turned to me. Scott shifted uncomfortably where he stood, his confident grin faltering as he glanced my way. "I've always been proud to call this family mine," I began, keeping my tone steady, my gaze scanning the crowd. "But recently, I discovered something that changed how I see things, something that made me question what family truly means." Scott's face drained of color, his grip tightening on the beer bottle in his hand. "I found out," I continued, my eyes locking onto his, "that not everyone here values family the way I do." The tension rippled through the gathering like an electric charge. Rebecca, standing off to the side, looked like she might collapse. Dylan's wide eyes fixed on me, a silent plea for clarity, though he didn't say a word. But I stopped there. This wasn't the time to lay everything bare. This moment wasn't about the full truth, it was about letting them know the reckoning was on its way. "To family," I said at last, raising my glass high. There was a murmur of agreement as everyone echoed the toast, but Scott's hands were visibly trembling as he lifted his drink. He knew. He knew the storm was coming. The barbecue turned into a quiet battleground after that. Conversations resumed, but they were subdued, punctuated by curious glances my way and Scott's increasingly awkward attempts at laughter. He gripped his beer too tightly, his smile too strained. The unease radiated off him like heat waves, and I relished every second of it. Good. Let him sweat. Dylan stuck close to me, his eyes darting between me and Scott as if trying to piece together the puzzle I had only half revealed. Rebecca, meanwhile, hovered at the edges of the yard, her forced smile barely masking the dread etched across her face. Every now and then, her expression would slip, and the fear underneath became glaringly obvious. I didn't push the truth further that night. That wasn't the point of my toast. It was about planting a seed of discomfort, letting them know I was the one pulling the strings now. The full reckoning would come later, when I was ready. But the next step arrived sooner than expected. As the sun sank below the horizon and guests began filtering out, Scott cornered me near the grill. His cocky grin had vanished, replaced with a tight, panicked expression. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. I took a slow sip of my drink, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him squirm. "Sure," I said finally, setting my glass down with deliberate calm. He led me around the side of the house, away from prying ears and curious eyes. When we were out of sight, he turned to me, his jaw clenched tight. "What the hell was that?" he demanded. "What was what?" I asked, feigning ignorance as I leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "That toast," he snapped, his voice edged with frustration. "You know exactly what I'm talking about." I gave him a small, calculated shrug. "If you're feeling guilty, Scott, that's your problem." His nostrils flared, and for a moment, I thought he might take a swing at me. Instead, he leaned in, lowering his voice to a harsh whisper. "Look, I told you it was a mistake, okay? It didn't mean anything. I told you that already. What more do you want from me?" I let his words hang in the air, watching as his bravado began to crumble under the weight of his guilt. "What do I want?" I repeated slowly, stepping closer until there was almost no space between us. "I want you to know this isn't going away. I want you to understand that you don't get to bury this and move on like it never happened." His face twisted in anger. "You think you're better than me?" he hissed. "You think you're some perfect saint? Newsflash, man, nobody's perfect. Not even you." I smiled then, slow and deliberate. "You're right, Scott. Nobody's perfect. But some of us don't destroy our families for a cheap thrill." His jaw tightened, his nostrils flaring again as he tried to hold back whatever retort was boiling inside him. Before he could speak, Dylan's voice rang out, slicing through the tension like a blade. "Dad?" Both Scott and I turned at the sound of Dylan's voice. He stood a few feet away, pale and wide-eyed, his confusion written all over his face. "What's going on?" he asked, looking between the two of us. Scott immediately took a step back, his expression slipping into something almost resembling guilt. But I wasn't about to let him control the narrative. "Dylan," I said, keeping my voice calm, "this is between me and Scott. Go back inside." But Dylan didn't budge. His gaze flicked between us, suspicion dawning in his eyes. "Why are you arguing? Is this about what you said last night?" I hesitated, torn between shielding him from the truth and letting it come out right then and there. Before I could decide, Scott made the critical mistake of speaking. "Dylan, your dad and I just..." "Don't lie to him," I snapped, cutting him off before he could spin a story. Dylan's head whipped toward me, his confusion deepening. "What's going on?" he asked again, his voice trembling. I took a deep breath, knowing there was no turning back. "Dylan," I said, meeting his eyes, "you deserve to know the truth. Scott isn't just your uncle. He's your biological father. The words hit like a thunderclap. Dylan stared at me, then at Scott, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to make sense of it. Finally, he took a step back, shaking his head in disbelief. "No," he said, his voice cracking. "No, that's not. It's true," I said gently, my heart aching as I saw the pain in his face. "I'm so sorry, son." Dylan turned to Scott then, his expression hardening into anger. "Is it true?" he demanded, his voice rising. Scott didn't answer. His silence said everything. "You've got to be kidding me!" Dylan shouted, his fury spilling out. How could you do this? How could you lie to me my whole life?" "Dylan, I didn't know," Scott began, but Dylan cut him off. "Don't," Dylan snapped, his voice sharp and final. "Just don't. You're nothing to me." Without another word, Dylan turned and stormed off into the night, leaving Scott and me alone in the darkness. Scott turned to me, his face a mix of anger and desperation. "You happy now?" he spat, his voice trembling with frustration. I smiled, a cold, deliberate smile. "Not yet. But I will be." Then I walked away, leaving him alone to stew in the disaster he'd created. The first domino had fallen, and there were plenty more lined up behind it. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of clarity and purpose. This wasn't about blind rage anymore. It was about justice, for me, for Dylan, and for the years of lies I'd carried without even knowing it. My plan started with the folder I'd been building over the past few weeks. It contained every piece of damning evidence against Scott, his illegal activities, unethical business practices, and all the corners he'd cut to get ahead. I made one final call to the private investigator to confirm everything was airtight. I wasn't sending a warning shot. This was going to be a direct hit. By midday, I had sent the folder to the state licensing board, several local news outlets, and a few of Scott's business partners. Each recipient had no choice but to act on the evidence. It was a calculated move. I wanted the fallout to unfold slowly and publicly, with Scott feeling the walls close in on him, piece by piece. That evening, I got a text from a distant family member. "Hey, did you see this?" Attached was a screenshot of a local news article. The headline read, "Local mechanic under investigation for fraud and environmental violations." Scott's name and business were front and center. I didn't reply, but a smirk crept across my face as I read it. The story was out, and there was no taking it back now. The next day, I took Dylan out for lunch. He'd been quiet since the barbecue, but I could see he was struggling to process everything. As we sat down over burgers and fries, I knew it was time to open up. "I need to talk to you about something," I said, setting my drink on the table. Dylan stiffened, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What now?" "It's about Scott," I began carefully. His jaw tightened, and he stayed quiet, waiting for me to explain. "He's not just your biological father," I said, choosing my words deliberately. "He's also a liar and a fraud. Everything he's built is falling apart because of the choices he's made." Dylan blinked, his expression caught between surprise and confusion. "What are you talking about?" I laid it all out for him, the illegal deals, the environmental violations, and how the evidence was already making waves in town. Dylan listened intently, his expression shifting as understanding began to take root. "So, you're taking him down?" he asked, a hint of something almost like admiration creeping into his voice. "I'm holding him accountable," I corrected. "This isn't just about revenge anymore. It's about consequences. People like Scott go through life hurting others, never thinking they'll have to face the fallout." Dylan nodded slowly, a small, bitter smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Good. He deserves everything he's getting." Later that week, word started spreading. Scott's shop had been temporarily shut down while a full investigation got underway. Customers were canceling their appointments, employees were quitting, and his business partners were cutting ties left and right. It was exactly what I had planned, a series of calculated blows that left him scrambling, unable to recover. And yet, there was no joy in it. Satisfaction, maybe, but not happiness. What Scott and Rebecca had taken from me could never be undone, no matter how much Scott suffered. That evening, I sat down with Dylan again. "You know," I said, looking him in the eye, "what Scott did, it doesn't define you. You're my son, and that's never going to change." Dylan held my gaze for a long moment before nodding. "I know, Dad. And I'm glad you're my father, not him." Hearing those words, I felt something shift. The real victory wasn't in Scott's downfall. It was in knowing that despite everything, I still had Dylan's love and trust. That was what truly mattered. The final phase of my plan was public. I called a family meeting at my house, inviting everyone, cousins, aunts, uncles. It wasn't unusual for us to gather like this, so no one suspected what was coming. When Scott walked in, his face was pale, and his usual bravado had been replaced with nervous energy. Rebecca lingered off to the side, looking like she wanted to melt into the walls. I waited until everyone was settled before standing at the front of the room. "There's something you all need to know," I said, my voice calm but firm. "A truth that's been hidden for far too long." I laid everything bare, the DNA test, Scott and Rebecca's affair, Dylan's parentage, and finally, the evidence of Scott's unethical and illegal business practices. By the time I finished, the room was in chaos. Family members shouted, some at Scott, others at Rebecca. The betrayal and anger in the air were palpable. Scott tried to defend himself, stammering out excuses, but the evidence was too strong. No one believed him. Rebecca sat silently, tears streaking her face as the weight of her choices bore down on her. Watching Scott squirm under the scrutiny of our family, I felt something close to closure. It wasn't joy or triumph, it was a quiet, resolute sense of justice. This was never about destroying him for the sake of it. It was about ensuring he could never hurt anyone else the way he had hurt me and Dylan. When the meeting ended, Scott left with his head hanging low, his reputation in ruins. Rebecca stayed behind, but there was nothing left to say between us. That night, as Dylan and I sat on the porch, he turned to me and asked, "Do you feel better now?" I thought about it for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, I do." Because in the end, this wasn't about Scott or Rebecca anymore. It was about protecting what mattered most, Dylan. And that, I realized, was the only revenge I truly needed. The day after the family meeting, the dust began to settle. Scott's reputation was in tatters, his business on the brink of collapse. The investigation into his shop was gaining momentum, and word of his affair with Rebecca had spread through the family like wildfire. Those who once admired him now wanted nothing to do with him. Scott was finished, both professionally and personally. Rebecca moved out later that week. There were no dramatic farewells, no begging for another chance. She packed her things quietly, leaving a note on the kitchen counter. It was brief, an apology and a promise to do better for Dylan's sake. When I read it, I didn't feel relief, anger, or sadness. Just emptiness. For Dylan, the weeks that followed were a mix of healing and moving forward. He threw himself into preparing for college, relying on me more than ever for guidance and support. If anything, the chaos had strengthened our bond. One evening, as we worked together in the garage fixing up his old bike, he glanced at me. "I still can't believe everything that happened," he said, his voice carrying the weight of everything we'd been through. "But I'm glad you were there for me, Dad." "Always," I replied, meaning it with every fiber of my being. Even with Scott's downfall and Rebecca's departure, I knew there was one last step I needed to take, not for revenge, but for myself. The anger I'd carried had served its purpose, but I couldn't hold on to it forever. It was time to let it go. I drove to Scott's shop, now closed and abandoned, and waited for him to arrive. When he finally pulled up, he looked like a ghost of the man he used to be. His clothes were rumpled, his face etched with stress and sleepless nights. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice cautious and weary. "I want to make something clear," I said, stepping closer. "This wasn't about destroying you, Scott. It was about stopping you from hurting anyone else." He looked away, his jaw tightening. "Are you happy now?" he asked bitterly. I shook my head. This was never about happiness. It was about consequences. And now it's done. He didn't reply, but I could see the weight of my words sinking in. As I turned to leave, I paused and looked back at him one last time. "I don't forgive you," I said, my voice firm. "But I'm done with you. Stay away from me and my son." He nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat, and I got into my car and drove away without looking back. That night, I sat on the porch with Dylan, watching the sun sink below the horizon. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. "Do you think things will ever go back to normal?" Dylan asked quietly, his gaze fixed on the fading light. "No," I said honestly. "But that's not always a bad thing. Sometimes, starting over is the best thing we can do." He nodded thoughtfully, and for the first time in a long while, I saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. The lesson I took from all of this was simple, yet profound. Life isn't about avoiding pain, it's about how you respond to it. Anger can fuel you for a while, but it won't heal you. Revenge might even the score, but it won't restore what you've lost. What really matters is protecting what remains and building something stronger from the ashes. For me, that meant focusing on Dylan. For Dylan, it meant looking ahead to his future. And for Scott, he got exactly what he deserved. As I closed this chapter of my life, I came to understand that real strength isn't in clinging to the past. It's in finding the courage to let it go. And so, I did.